Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to October's UK Climate Projections webinar series. Today we have two speakers, Paul Buckley from CFAS and Victoria Ramsay from the Met Office. Paul will be talking about understanding the climate change risks in the UK marine environment. Paul, I'll introduce both Paul and Victoria now. Paul is, and I've got a conflict of interest here, I mustn't forget. If I say anything too good about MCCIP, I was the co-PI on MCCIP when it was first set up in the mid-2000s. Okay, a couple of years back. So it's good to see that MCCIP is still going. Probably thrive without my involvement in it. But Paul's based at CFAS. He's a program manager for the UK Marine Climate Impacts Partnership, and has also led a range of EU and international science communication projects. So. And then we'll be followed that by Q&A on Paul's talk, and then Victoria will give an overview of the new UKCP rainfall guidance from the projections. Victoria is a senior scientist within the Urban Climate Services team at the Met Office, and Victoria engages with urban stakeholders to enable the development of novel, usable and tailored ways to deliver climate information to assist decision making. Victoria's work focuses on using climate information and GIS to analyse heat hazards in the urban space, and also vulnerability to understand changing heat risks in cities. Very pertinent after last year's events and also some of the heat waves this year. But since we last met, we've had Storm Babette, which has given very severe impacts across the whole of the country, or the majority of the country. Even here in Norfolk, where I live, and East Anglia, I think Framingham and Suffolk had over 200 mil of rain in a 48-hour period, which is getting on a third of their annual total, 3 times their normal for October, and many places have recorded their wettest ever October, coupled to a very warm year as well. So the Central England temperature record for 2023 is running almost the same as last year, which was the warmest on record as well. So another very warm year, this time characterised by a very wet October. So we're seeing these impacts, and we've got to face it, we're not dealing very well with them in places. We're seeing flood defences breached, we're seeing homes flooded, we're seeing livelihoods impacted across the country. Even in my small village here, a number of houses which hadn't, for anyone's knowledge, had never been flooded before, have been flooded. So these impacts are causing shocks to a new set of the population who've never experienced these impacts before. So they're devastating when they happen. They cause a lot of stress. So mustn't forget those human impacts on top of the physical impacts we're seeing as well. So I will now fire over to Paul. As I mentioned, Paul's responsible for the Marine Climate Impacts Programme. It's a great piece of work. So let's hear a bit more about that. Thank you, Paul.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. I should probably let you do my first introductory slides to this. So hopefully everyone can see it and everyone can hear me properly. So yeah, as David said, I'm going to talk broadly about climate change risks in the UK marine environment, how they've been characterised a little bit. And I'm going to be principally speaking from that perspective as the programme lead for the Marine Climate Change Impacts Partnership. So just to give you a bit of background to that, David's right, it was about the mid-2000s. David was there slightly before me. I didn't start till 2006, but yeah, the partnership was broadly set up back then in response to a State of the UK Seas report that kind of identified that the evidence for marine climate change impacts was starting to grow in the UK, but no one was really collecting it in one place, certainly for that kind of use by a policy audience. So we kind of set up as a broad-based partnership back then, largely kind of comprising of UK government, its agencies, devolved agencies as well, but also a range of scientific networks as well, and NGOs and industry end users. And when we tend to broadly have a similar range of partners today as it is. So yeah, in terms of the work that we do, front and centre has always been the impacts evidence reporting that we do across a wide range of topics. We broadly divide these across kind of looking at changes in the physical environment. What risk do we see there? What's happening in terms of things like sea level rise, temperature change, ocean acidification, those kind of things. And then looking through to how that's affecting marine and coastal ecosystems, whether that be from the very smallest bits, from the plankton, all the way through to marine mammals and seabirds. And then finally, looking more broadly at kind of societal scale impacts, whether that be from things like coastal flooding, or whether we're looking at more offshore in terms of infrastructure and things like that. Over time, we've tried to use some of that evidence a little bit more to think about how we build solutions. So we've engaged widely with the kind of conservation sector, trade associations. So in particular, we've worked with people like Seafish to look at impacts on wild capture fisheries and aquaculture, and also kind of the marine leisure industry and things like that. So trying to apply that kind of understanding fairly widely. And then, sorry, my slides just looked ahead. And then more recently, we started to work overseas, so trying to apply some of these kind of best practice approaches, specifically in the UK overseas territories. We've done assessment now across all of the 14 very diverse UK overseas territories. So that was a good starting point there. So whilst we were initially set up to really provide that link between science and policy, then over time, certainly we've tried to engage with a wide range of stakeholders as well. So hopefully this is a useful introduction today.
Paul,
so in terms of
Paul, just sorry to interrupt you.
Yep.
Which slide do you see? Because I think it's not in sync.
Okay, yeah, it came slightly out of sync there. Yeah, I'm on slide 6 now. So this brief history of marine and UKCP. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, maybe you have to tell me when to move to the next slide. It seems.
All right, that might be a bit easier. No, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, in terms of the first half of the talk, I'm really going to try and frame some of these marine risks around what's been happening from a UK climate projections perspective in terms of marine, and then looking through the lens of the successive climate change risk assessments and how marine risks have been treated through that. So next slide, please. Sorry, are you okay to go on to the next slide? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of UK climate projections, and I've tried to go back a bit in time here, the marine's got a fairly long history as part of them. I couldn't see any evidence as part of UKCP 98 in there, but certainly by UKCP 02, then we had some projections, at least for sea level rise and also sea surface temperature, which is the one that you can see on the left-hand side, and at that point we had a range of scenarios. We had 4 scenarios, which was a luxury at that point, and looking at kind of similar timeframes that we tend to look through these days when we're doing some of the climate reporting. So that kind of 2050s, 2080s as well. By the time we got through to UKCP 09, then certainly those maps have been produced were much more highly resolved, and we had a wider range of variables that we were able to look at through that process. You can see at the top. And we also had that particular indication around H++ sea level rise projections, which I don't think is a feature now, but at the time, then it was being quite widely used in terms of things like contingency planning around things like the nuclear industry as well. But in terms of projection itself, we had a medium emissions scenario to work with and a fairly limited understanding around the range of uncertainty around that. There was some subsequent work done to kind of improve that uncertainty side of things, but it was around that particular scenario. And then finally, when we got to UKCP 18, I think there was a general feeling amongst the marine community that it had dropped off the list a little bit by the time we'd got to that. So the marine report very much focuses on the sea level rise and surge aspects, with a bit of coverage of waves, that were kind of drawn in from a range of other projects that were going on at the time. There has been a bit further development since then in terms of work that's been done beyond that, but we're kind of starting to think now how we start to influence what happens in the next set of UK climate projections. Next slide, please. Yeah, it's not catching up my side. Nia, I don't know, I was looking on your side on the slides.
I'm on slide 8.
Oh, okay, that's not showing for me, so I need to. catch up. So yeah, so looking at the kind of marine aspects through the lens of the climate change risk assessments, we've had 3 of them so far, just to give you a view of how that's evolved over time. So in the first CCRA, which I think was probably more their bells and whistles CCRA that happened, there was quite a big focus on marine. It featured as one of the 11 sector reports that took place, and in the marine space, there were a long list of over 80 risks identified at that time, which is kind of characterized here in what they were calling the Pringle diagram for fairly obvious reasons. So it kind of shows you the range of marine risks that we were starting to look at that time. There's probably a bit of a better understanding about what was happening in regard to marine ecosystems, marine species at that time. Probably a bit less so in terms of the human population side of things, outside of things like coastal flooding and erosion. And then probably even less so in terms of climate change impacts relating to industries, particularly those that were happening offshore at the time. So certainly by the time that those risks had been progressed through to the final reports, there's 11 of them made it through from the 80. They featured fairly low down in that overall ranking of that. And that kind of came through because of a kind of stated lack of quantification and evidence at the time. Next slide, please. So hopefully you're seeing the slide that's on about the second climate change risk assessment. So certainly by then, the whole process had been pared back a bit, and this was certainly reflected in terms of how marine sector risks were characterized in there. Overall, there was only 6 priority risks that time round, and almost a passing mention in terms of the marine side of those things. Marine had kind of been downgraded to a research priority at that point rather than the more action needed side of things. And the whole of marine was starting to be characterized in this one fairly amorphous risk that was ocean acidification, high water temperature risk for marine species, fisheries, and marine heritage. So it felt kind of clunky how those things had been pulled together. So trying to interpret those risks and what that might mean in terms of thinking about adaptation programs as well was coming quite difficult at that point. So next slide, please. So yeah, hopefully you see my slide now that's on the 3rd climate change risk assessment that was done last year and completed. And certainly in terms of looking at the marine side of things came to the fore a little bit more. Broadly speaking, still looking at those risks to species and habitats across that marine and coastal space, but a bit more emphasis in looking at the kind of risk that we might see from pest pathogens and non-native species, and certainly starting to see the emergence of issues around natural carbon stores and a lot of discussion around what's going to happen to blue carbon around the UK. Certainly more interest around coastal communities coming up at that time. But off in the other corner, then kind of thinking about risk to offshore infrastructure, whether this because of that lack of evidence that we've had, we're still being graded as a kind of sustain the action that we've got watching brief. And given how much we're feeling the marine environment at the moment, it feels like there probably needs to be a bit more research going on in that space. Next slide, please, Neha. Sorry, can I just check that you are getting the right slides on there? It should be on.
Yes, I am, Paul.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
You're on slide 11.
Okay, no, that's fine. One slide was missing, but that's right. So just to kind of round that off on the CCRA side of things, then we're starting to think ahead and plan towards CCRA 4. So we held a early marine sector workshop around that just a couple of weeks ago. So kind of building on the stuff that I was talking on there, then certainly feeling from that community there needs to be continued improvement in terms of the kind of spatial temporal representation of marine variables, and certainly temperature and acidification was coming up in that respect. Certainly more interest in trying to understand that variability around UK seas in how UK species and habitats are likely to be impacted and where they're most likely to show resilience. And that includes to multiple stresses as well, not just from climate change drivers, but things like pollution and other sector activities that are going on in the sea. And there's also much more interested in things like some of the extreme events. So not just thinking about what might happen to storm activity over time and how that might affect offshore infrastructure, but also thinking about things like marine heat waves and what that might mean for different sectors. And we're starting to see a bit more research emerge around that. So there's been some work done, for instance, by CFAS looking at how fisheries might be affected over time, both in terms of having an increased amount of heat waves over time and how that affects spawning and recruitment, but also how that might affect cold spells as well and what that means for other species too. So in terms of trying to understand some of those things, there has been some development in terms of those marine projection side of things. So the Met Office have recently published a whole set of new outputs that builds on the UKCP 18 findings. So that's broadly based around some of the high end stuff. So we've only got it for RCP 8.5, but it's certainly a big improvement on what we've got in the current UKCP 18 marine sector report. So similar variables again to what was shown for UKCP 09. So that's now available, and that was through John Tinker and others at the Met Office. So just kind of moving on from that, thinking about some of the risks that we're looking at through current MCCIP activities. Next slide, please. Then in terms of kind of bringing together the evidence at the moment, these are the kind of topics that we're looking at. Hopefully you can see the right screen. I don't think it's syncing at all to the ones that I've got. So yeah, across that kind of physical space, ecosystem, societal impacts, we've recently published about 13 different topics around that, and we're hoping to get all of that set of 20 published by early next year. So hopefully some topics there that would seem useful to you in terms of the issues that you're interested in at the moment. And then when we move on from that stage, we'll be looking to have this kind of iterative rolling update. So as and when new evidence comes to light, then we can start to update those reports pretty quickly rather than waiting for kind of periodic report cards that we've done in the past. Next slide, please. So in terms of accessing that information, just wanted to briefly say that the way that we present marine risk through those evidence reports is that we have that all on the website now. So we have summaries that brings out the key messages, key headlines for what's happening now and in the future. Something that's always been central to kind of reporting on risk from our side of things is showing the confidence statements for both that now and future side of things in terms of what evidence is available and the consensus around that. And then trying to pick up a bit more on the kind of key challenges, emerging issues that are coming through. So that's really the bite-sized bit of the peer-reviewed evidence reports that we produce for all of those. Next slide, please. So yeah, so behind all of those things, there are 10 to 20 page reports that we're trying to standardize a bit more now. And hopefully that provides the detailed supporting evidence very thoroughly peer reviewed by specialists in each of the topic areas that can be then fed in through to things like the CCRA and other national reporting requirements. Next slide, please.
Paul, could you please confirm which slide are you on?
Yeah, so there should be a slide that says UK marine ecosystem impacts and the future warming pathways.
Which number slide is that?
That's slide number 15.
Thanks.
So yeah, so related to all of the stuff that I've talked about so far, we're trying to take forward a piece of work that kind of brings together our understanding, particularly around impacts on marine ecosystems under future warming pathways. So recent CCRA, certainly CCRA 3, has been kind of framed around these 2050, 2080 kind of timeframes and these 2 and 4 degrees of warming, which probably translates a bit easier in terms of over land and the atmospheric environment, but trying to understand what that means for localized marine conditions is slightly more challenging. So we're trying to provide a bit more of a consistent approach around that, try to pull together both in terms of the physical drivers have changed and those ecosystem impacts, the evidence that currently exists and how that kind of fits into that type of framework, and then looking at kind of a roadmap of future needs going forward as well. And we're trying to link up very much with the National Partnership for Ocean Prediction that includes Met Office, the National Oceanography Centre and others that are trying to think about how we best develop future marine projections, and certainly with a view to informing the next round of UK climate projections. So as part of this process, we will produce some targeted research outputs. They'll be probably based around some specific evidence that we've got for marine species, probably something on harmful algal blooms as well, and pests and pathogens, to try and supplement some of the evidence that we've got around CCRA3. And then we'll be looking to summarise, share that evidence more widely as that's done. Next slide, please. So kind of related to that work, we've just been involved in a piece of work for UKRI that was around climate smart marine spatial planning. So again, I guess in its own way, it's trying to characterize these marine warming pathways in UKC. So it looks at both a 2-degree future and a 4-degree future, and very much looking at the kind of resilience of the marine environment over time. So looking through from now towards the end of century. And that work's particularly picked up on 3 different sectors, albeit they're fairly broad. So that includes the fishery sector, aquaculture in the marine environment, and also marine conservation species. So what the work principally does is to try and identify areas in UKCs where we've got the emergence of climate change hotspots, where it might be less favourable for fisheries, aquaculture and marine conservation, certainly in the current sense of what we're trying to protect and cultivate, and also where there might be refuge, where there might be longer term resilience to climate change that might help direct where some of these activities might take place in the future. So that's all in the process of finalising. There's the infographic available now. There'll be a technical report and a summary to go out, and then a long period of engagement with users to make sure that these findings can be applied elsewhere. Next slide, please. Finally, just a couple of other things that we're working on at the moment. I mentioned briefly before about impacts on coastal communities. It's something that we've struggled to find evidence for in our impacts reporting in the past, but it's certainly coming through a lot more strongly through things like CCRA3 and requirements for the National Adaptation Programme. So we're going to start a piece of work to initially to try and bring a fairly broad-based community together, and I think that would be quite a diverse interest groups around that. So that might include the research community and the policy community, but also things like health professionals, coastal partnerships, local councils and things like that, where we can get quite a wide range of views and use that as a basis to trying to map the effects of climate change in that space, and trying to link it through to health and well-being of people living at the coast. So I think once we've done a little bit more of that, got that community together, done some of that mapping, we'll look at some of those key nodes and the pathways through it, and think about how we might start to assess some of the risk in some of those areas and think about response options. So I think there'll probably be elements of place-based studies that need to come into it to give it a bit more meat on the bones, really, in some of that wider context for across UK coasts and seas as well. So off the back of that, we'll publish those outputs and then look to try and do a bit more engagement activity, both within the coastal communities themselves, but also in terms of raising that at that policy level too. Next slide, please. So finally, a last piece of work that we're doing around fisheries and aquaculture. So there's a lot of work going on, building on some of the stuff that I talked about before, such as that MSpace program, the reports that we've published through MCCIP recently. Seafish, as the trade association for seafood and aquaculture, are in the process of updating their report. So there's lots of evidence out there at the moment, and an increasing interest in things like zero carbon fish and aquaculture. So an opportunity for us to really bring a lot of this emerging evidence together and try and provide some fairly targeted responses to a set of policy questions that the partnership has developed. So that's ranging through from looking at some of these impacts around net zero, but also looking around resilience, management tools, marine protected areas, fishing fleets and aquaculture production. So across all those different policy question areas, we'll be needing to think about how we use UK climate projections as best we can. So hopefully you got the gist of most of that talk. Sorry, there was a bit of jumping around between slides. It didn't seem to be syncing through to my presentation particularly well, but that's where I'm going to close for that. So yeah, I'll take any questions off the back of that.
Paul, thank you very much. Just for, I've paid my internet's got a bit slow here. Just in terms of answering Q&A, if people can use the question and answer function button on the top, please.
Okay.
And they'll appear in the side. While people get around to looking at that, just a couple of points from me, or questions from me. How the European Environment Agency also has a indicators report. How do you work with them closely, and how do you dovetail with across the the boundaries within the north, or the borders within the North Sea, for instance?
I would say that MCCIP hasn't particularly engaged with them, not recently at least. There were someone that we talked to certainly earlier on in the partnership. I would say probably some of those European ties are less close than they used to be, for some fairly obvious reasons. So I think some of those engagements across the different nations that share the North Sea have come primarily through some of the work that we've done at CFAS, albeit when we're doing kind of reporting at that kind of OSPAR type level. So looking at a lot of those Northeast Atlantic countries as well, and US. So when we're doing those kind of things, I think they tend to still draw on the kind of MCCIP report on it, because we broadly look at European shelf seas rather than kind of demarcating things at some nominal UK boundary. So I think in terms of reporting that we do, it normally extends to those boundaries. So it is feeding through in terms of that sense. But in terms of thinking about things like indicators in that European level, we're less engaged on that side.
Okay, thank you. And we've just got a question here through from Conrad Core. How does MCCIP use technology to environmentally sense changes in coastal areas and UK seas?
I don't think that we do directly. I mean, I guess we're effectively that communication piece at the end of a lot of the research that's happening. So we might feed through in terms of the technologies that are changing, in terms of how the emerging issues that we've got, but we wouldn't kind of engage directly on that side of things. I guess it would be some of the more individual institutes that feed into our work, whether that's the National Oceanography Centre, PML, and other people like that on that side of things. But as and when that starts emerging, it starts to show some evidence of climate change patterns that we're interested in, we'd certainly be looking to pick up on that.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here. Fog. Stephen from Stephen Swarby. Fog incidents around the Isle of Scilly's have been increasing. Recorded as 1% of the time in 1958, 10% today. Apparently related to SSTs, or increasing SST. Does this local impact get felt? How do you look at that locality of incidents such as fog, which is again more of a benign impact, but one that causes a lot of problems for local communities? Yeah,
I mean, again, I think that's probably too fine a level of granularity in terms of the things that we would report on, in terms of the things that we look at. I think there's an opportunity to start looking at those things through some of the adaptation work that we're doing. So as we start to look at things like coastal communities and the knock-on effects that things like that might have, we can start to draw those things in as we start to look at that more specific level. But I think it's more localized areas that we'll be looking at those kind of issues, whether the Scottish adaptation programs would be a bit more interested in that, and some of the local institutes in that area. But yeah, for us, it's probably a bit of a too fine a level for us to really deal with as we're doing the overall summaries.
I just take Chair's liberty here. In terms of looking at changes in SST over time, if you look at the UK terrestrial environment, we compartmentalise up into the geographical regions, etc. Are you doing something similar in the marine environment? So we can look at the change in SST over, say, the southern North Sea off the coast of East Anglia compared to the Irish Sea, or
I think that's certainly things that we're interested in, and certainly how that then translates to the effects on species. I think, it's often been said about the southern North Sea being that kind of hotspot for climate change. We continue to see some of those signals emerging in those areas. So I think we are interested in that. I think we're less interested in putting some of the slightly artificial boundaries that we used to have around the coast of the UK. You might remember, David, the old charting progress regions. There used to be quite a lot of interest in reporting at that scale. Less so, but that still emerges for some of the topics that we talk about. So that's still some currency somewhere around it. But yeah, certainly for us, that regional spread, probably more related to national boundaries, is of a bit more interest. But I know through the work that we're doing with like the MSpace program, there's always such a strong emphasis on not being hung up on these national boundaries and these transboundary issues we need to consider. So probably trying to move away from it, but at the same time still wanted to capture some of those regional differences.
Yeah, but also looking at, say, estuarine areas, so you look at the warming specifically in the Thames estuary as opposed to the Bristol estuary, etc. Is that something?
Yeah, there's a level of reporting on that in there without being so specific that we're pulling out, so many case studies around the countries. But I guess some of those things are starting to come through in different areas, whether that be around reporting on things like salinity, certification, sea surface temperature as well.
Okay, look, Paul, thank you very much for that. Just one final shout out for MCCIP. On their website, if you visit the website, you'll also see they provide information for the UK overseas territories. So it's not just confined to the UK and the British Isles. So to go further afield, I don't think I was invited to go and visit any of those at the time.
No, mate. Next time, David, we'll get the ticket sorted out.
Okay.
When the funding increases.
Right. Cheers, then, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Can I hand over now to Victoria, please?
Yep. Thanks, David. Okay, I'll make a start, and I'll just double check the slides are syncing properly as I go through. So hi everybody, and thanks for the intro at the start. My name is Victoria Ramsay, and I'm here today to provide an overview of a new UKCP rainfall guidance document that we've been working on over the last year or so. I'd particularly like to thank our external UKCP user group, the Development and Knowledge Sharing Network, particularly our EA and SIPA colleagues from that group who have provided input and reviews of this information for us. Neha, can I just check that it's on the UKCP Climate Service slide?
Yes, it is, Victoria. Please go ahead.
Perfect. Okay. So for those of you who are maybe new to this webinar series, the work in terms of the guidance document sits under the DEFRA-funded UKCP Climate Service project, which has been running since 2021. The purpose of the Climate Service is to enhance the UK's capacity to embed the latest climate information provided by climate science into climate change risk assessment and adaptation decision making. And as I mentioned earlier, we have an external user group called the UKCP Development and Knowledge Sharing Network that brings together users from across the UK from a range of sectors, and it includes users who are very new to UKCP right through to those who are more advanced. And this group is really important for defining, prioritising and co-designing the services that we develop within this programme, and also for sharing their own experiences of best practice in applying climate information in their own analysis and their own provision of services. So this work that I'm talking to you about today sits under Work Package 5, which aims to improve access to climate information and data services in terms of both physical accessibility, but also providing guidance information to enhance the uptake and use of climate information. And I'm really pleased to announce that as of today, we have 3 guidance documents that are now live on our website that have been produced by the UKCP Climate Service team. The first is the rainfall guidance that I will take you through shortly. The second is a guidance document around storms that my colleague Jenny Pirrett developed, and it will feature in December's webinar. There's also a new starters guide that was developed by my colleague James Pope. If you're new to picking up the UKCP climate projections, if you're picking them up for the first time, I would highly recommend taking a look at that one. So just back to the rainfall guidance then, I thought it'd be helpful to provide some background of how this guide came about, which has resulted in the structure that you will see in the document. When we were designing the work plan and what that might look like for the UKCP Climate Service, it was evident from the user group that more information was needed around rainfall. So we held a focus group with members who were particularly interested in rainfall information and providing feedback on what type of information they needed. So we first off wanted to understand what type of rainfall information is currently being used. And you can see that summarised in the table there, ranging from observation data sets to rainfall uplifts for assessing impacts of climate change. And also there's a range of climate projection information itself that's being used that's based on UKCP 18. We then looked at focusing the discussion around trying to understand what else users need. And this ranged from rainfall information at various return periods to sub-hourly information and information on how rainfall is changing across space. When we looked at the requirements, we felt that there were some data sets already out there providing some of this information, and that a guidance document bringing this information together in one place might be helpful. We also had a requirement to understand how these data sets relate to UKCP products and therefore understanding the uncertainty information around them. And there is also a clear need for further data sets on rainfall that are perhaps maybe best placed elsewhere within other projects, or we can feed that back into informing how we develop our future UK climate information. So looking at the document itself, the purpose of this guidance document is to highlight what rainfall information currently exists within UKCP and what to consider when choosing a data product. It also provides information on other tools and data sets that have been developed within the field since the release of UKCP 18 that are linked with the UKCP data. And this guidance is aimed at practitioners in industry, research, government or other organisations who have some level of existing knowledge of rainfall analysis. There are 5 key sections to the guidance document that I will take you through, and also there's some additional pieces of information at the end that I will touch on briefly as well. So let's start off by looking at what information is available to understand recent and future changes in rainfall. There's a wealth of information that has already been published or is published periodically on the current and future changes in rainfall. And we didn't want to rewrite what was already out there. So this section signposts you to where you can obtain that information. There's the Met Office National Climate Information Centre that publishes a range of observed rainfall information for the UK, including rainfall maps, climate summaries and information on extremes, which is regularly updated. And there's a link to that in the document. There's also links to the State of the UK Climate Report, which is published annually and provides the most up-to-date assessment on observed changes in rainfall and other variables as well. There's also a range of publications on future changes in rainfall from the likes of the UKCP Headline Findings Report to special reports on each of the products. And there is a UKCP fact sheet on precipitation that summarises the key information from these reports as well. There's also been some new research that has been published looking at rainfall extremes using the convection permitting model that underpins our UKCP local projections. And that's in the bottom right diagram there. This research looks at the number of rainfall events that have an intensity of greater than 20 millimetres per hour, which can lead to flash flooding. It found that under a high emission scenario, these types of rainfall events could be 4 times more frequent by 2080 compared to the 1980s. However, this value changes depending on where you are in the UK. The research also found that the intensity of events could increase by between 5 and 15% per degree of regional warming. And again, this change is uneven across the UK, with the greatest increases expected in the northwest. Moving on to section 2, this focuses on what rainfall products are available from UKCP and when you should use them. So there's a table in the guidance document, Table 1, that summarises the different UKCP products and some of their uses for rainfall applications. The green icons in the table highlight which products sample uncertainty from greenhouse gas emissions and model uncertainty. For example, the probabilistic products sample both, while the global product shown there only samples model uncertainty, as it includes both the Met Office Perturb Parameter Ensemble and CMIP5 models, but has only been produced for RCP 8.5. The orange icons highlight the temporal resolution of the rainfall information that's available, whether that be hourly, daily, monthly, or something else. And the blue icons summarise which rainfall applications the products should be used for. For example, the probabilistic projections are good for assessing changes in rainfall at a specific location and not at multiple locations where spatial coherence is important, whereas the global, regional and local products are better for assessing rainfall across multiple locations as they're spatially coherent. Also, the probabilistic extremes product, as the name suggests, should be used for assessing extremes, whereas the global product is better for assessing broad changes in rainfall and for large-scale impact studies where spatial detail is less important. There is also further information on the implications of considering different strands of uncertainty and the use of different UKCP products for assessing uncertainty. I've included 2 lots of figures here that feature in the guidance. I won't go into them in great detail here, but the first relates to model uncertainty and compares the seasonal mean changes in precipitation across all of the UKCP products. The second set of figures there show the plots compare UKCP regional and local in the blue and the red there, compares it against the CEH Gear observation dataset and how well they represent hourly precipitation extremes at different return levels. And here you can see the model used for our UKCP regional projections tends to overestimate the higher return periods in summer. There's an additional table within the guidance that I haven't shown here in terms of time, but it provides information on some of the caveats and limitations of each of the UKCP products to be aware of, specifically around rainfall. So section 3 looks at where you can go to find UKCP rainfall data, and this will be very much dependent on the type of information that you want and which format that you want it in. So our website provides a hub of information around UKCP. It hosts the headline findings. There is a key results spreadsheet, and it's also where these guidance documents live, and also the larger science reports as well. We also have our UKCP user interface where you can download data sets in the likes of CSV format and plot graphs and maps for the UK. We also have the CEDA archive. The information is up on there. You can download large data sets from this service and the raw data if you'd like to perform your own analysis using the likes of NetCDF files. We then also have the Climate Data Portal. This is the newest channel for accessing UKCP information. It went live earlier this year, and it's our new geospatial platform that allows you to view and download data sets in formats that are compatible with GIS. You can also create your own maps through this service and overlay your own data as well. And there's links to all of these within the guidance document. Then section 4 looks at what UKCP rainfall products should you use. Since the release of UKCP 18, there have been many data products that have been developed on rainfall, and this section provides an overview of what data is out there and its connection to the UKCP products themselves. So we focus on data sets that are based on or complement UKCP. However, this is not an exhaustive list of data sets that are available for analysing rainfall. In consultation with users, we group the data into primary, derived and impact data. And primary data is data that information from raw observations or the UKCP climate projections themselves. When we talk about derived data, that is information that's derived from the primary data that is not a direct output from observations or the climate models themselves. So for example, it could be climate indicators that have been calculated based on the projections or rainfall frequency information. Then impact data is data that is outputs from impact models that have been driven by perhaps some of the primary or derived data sources. So for example, high and low flow data sets. We've also included a decision tree to help you navigate to an appropriate data set, depending on whether you want to understand observed changes in rainfall or if you want more high-level summary information or spatial rainfall information or information on extremes. The final column there highlights data sets that may be based on UKCP information that's been fed into the likes of a hydrological model to provide information for the likes of flood risk analysis or water resources management. Each of the data sets within the decision tree are then captured in a more detailed table within the report. And this is just a snapshot of some of the things that we have in there. The purpose of this table is not to recommend a specific data product, as this will be highly dependent on the use case. And as I said, it's not to provide a comprehensive list of the data products that are out there. We have only included free to access data and services. We are aware of several paid for services, but we haven't included them in this document. And as I mentioned earlier, we set out the key caveats and limitations around using UKCP products for analysing rainfall earlier in the document. But we also recommend that users familiarise themselves with the caveats and limitations linked to the non-Met Office datasets that are provided in this table as well. So the table itself provides a short description of each dataset and highlights which rainfall data is used to generate the dataset. For example, is it observations or one of the strands of UKCP or something else? There's information on the spatial resolution of the data and whether it has been bias corrected. For example, most of the datasets shown here don't use bias corrected data, but you can see the likes of the E flag and the impact relevant indicators use bias corrected UKCP information. There's also links to where you can find this information and what applications you can use it for. If there is an example of where this data has been used in practice, it has been included as well. And just to illustrate, I've picked out an example from the table. I've picked out the information from the Enhanced Future Flows and Groundwater project. This project has produced a bias-corrected, nationally consistent time series of precipitation and potential evapotranspiration data. And these data sets have been fed into a series of hydrological models to produce future projections of river flow, groundwater level and groundwater recharge. The rainfall information is based on our UKCP regional projections. So the considerations, caveats, limitations that are detailed in this rainfall guidance document apply there. There's also lots of case studies that have been developed to show how this data can be used in water resources modelling and planning. There's a link in the guidance document that takes you to a YouTube video of one of the webinars from the eFlag project where they demonstrate some of these case studies. To provide a more, a more simplistic summary of how the different data sets and tools mentioned in the document relate to UKCP, in section 5 there is a Venn diagram that maps each of the data sets or tools that are mentioned in the document to the underlying UKCP product, so you can revert back to the earlier sections and understand the implications of that. And just finally, I wanted to just flag that there's several sections at the end of the report that provide additional information on some of the other requests that came in that we had from users. One was in relation to whether sub-hourly information is available in UKCP, and in that section, it explains that observed sub-hourly rainfall records are very limited in number, especially for extreme rainfall events. So as a result, it's really difficult to evaluate climate model performance at the sub-hourly timescale. So we have therefore with greater confidence in our climate model outputs at the hourly timescales, which are provided through our UKCP local product. We also thought we would highlight where UKCP information fits into the likes of the climate change allowances for flood risk assessment by their guidance by regulatory bodies. So climate change uplifts that were developed through the likes of the Future Drainage Project that's based on our UKCP local information have been applied in guidance set out by the EA and SEPA in their climate change allowances for flood risk assessment guidance. At the time of writing, guidance in Wales and Northern Ireland has not yet been updated. And we've also signposted to where you can find guidance on how to use this information in relation to the likes of FEH 13 and FEH 22 rainfall models as well. We also had requests for information around probable maximum precipitation, and our understanding is that there's an EA funded project currently underway that is reviewing the methods for estimating probable maximum precipitation and also probable maximum flood, and also developing an updated catalogue of observed extreme floods and rainstorms in the UK. I just checked this the other day, and the outputs of this are due to be released sometime in the winter of 2023-2024. So I will finish there. There is a QR code there where you can access the rainfall guidance. I'll also pop links in the chat to the different rainfall and storms and other guidance that's been released today. And yes, if you have any questions, that'd be great. Thanks.
Victoria, thank you very much. I'll just jump to one question that was asked straight away, is from Benjamin Hex. Where can we find out more information about the themes of the working groups? I'm wondering if anyone is contributing / attending from a Welsh perspective.
Yeah, so with the UKCP DaKS network, we do try and have a good geographical spread across the UK. So we do have some Welsh counterparts within that group. But yes, perhaps in a future webinar we can maybe share more information on those activities. And
Benjamin also Paul responded from a MCCIP perspective in the post in the Q&A as well. And Lewis Judic has asked, is there any real-time or forecasted rainfall data for weather prediction or flood monitoring purposes available?
Off the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe one of my other colleagues on the call. I think there is definitely data available. How that is made available, I would have to double check that and come back to you on it. Not sure if one or other of my colleagues might know that. I suppose in a way that one.
The best one would be from the radar data, the rain for whether that's freely available or commercially available. I think that's a question for the Met Office. Just one of the questions was asked in relationship to Storm Babette and the rainfall is, how easily available are return periods for these type of events? I know they can be confusing because often, especially in the rate of change in our climate, we're seeing events return periods getting broken quite quickly, or you get a number of events with, one in X 100-year rainfall events occurring every 10 years or so. But is there any information about the return period stay for Storm Babette, or how long does that take to get produced?
Yeah, so there are colleagues that do try and kind of work these things out in kind of real time. There is one of my colleagues on the call that might want to come in on this, because I know that's kind of their area of expertise. Jenny, are you able to talk? Just
Sorry,
unmute your mic.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I was trying to find the answer to the previous question about real-time data information.
It was about how quickly we can turn around those like understanding of return period events from the likes of Storm Babette and things.
How quickly we can do it? I think it depends on the sort of scientific approach we'd take, and the and sort of who commissioned the work, who's paying for the work, I guess always can come up. But I think it's a work in progress at the moment. I think there is an event report, I think, being written about Storm Babette. There was a similar one written for the 6th and 7th of October, and that will contain everything that we know as now, but we will continue to research it over the coming weeks and months, I imagine.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Look, just bearing in mind time, and approaching the hour mark now. Look, Victoria, thank you very much. Neha, I presume these slides will all be made available. The QR codes work. I've tried that. Well, I've made them work, so that's not bad for my use of the tech. So just in terms of next approaches, the next webinar is on the 23rd of November. The same time, so we have Daphne from Synopsys from EDF, Phil Ransom from Met Office looking at the use of the data. And extreme value analysis of met hazards. There you go. That might answer the questions we've just asked. Also, I'd just like to thank colleagues at UKCP, Neha, Sitlali, Lottie, and I mustn't forget Fire, of course. He deserves a mention. So thank you very much for getting this all organised. Any questions at all, please get in touch with us. Any comments about how we're presenting this, please let us know. Very much appreciated. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.